My father stood up at Thanksgiving dinner, lifted his glass, and called me a thief in front of 30 relatives. For a moment, no one moved. The sound of forks against plates stopped one by one until the entire dining room fell into a silence so heavy I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. The smell of roasted turkey and sage stuffing still hung in the air, warm and familiar, but suddenly it felt like I was sitting in a courtroom instead of my parents' home in suburban Ohio. My name is Daniel Carter, I'm 38 years old, and until that night I believed my family might argue sometimes, but we would never turn on each other in front of everyone we loved. The Carter Thanksgiving dinner had always been a tradition. Every year my parents hosted it in the same colonial house they bought back in 1987, the one with the long oak dining table my father insisted could seat at least 30 if we squeezed. And that night we had almost exactly 30. Cousins, uncles, aunts, spouses, teenagers scrolling on their phones under the table, even my great-uncle Frank who still drove 2 hours from Toledo every year despite being well into his 70s. My mother, Linda Carter, had spent 2 days preparing the meal, and the table looked like something from a magazine, the golden turkey in the center, bowls of mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, cranberry sauce in a crystal dish that had belonged to my grandmother. Everything about the evening should have felt comforting. But the moment I stepped into the house earlier that afternoon, something had already felt wrong. My mother hugged me quickly but didn't meet my eyes. My father gave me a short nod instead of his usual clap on the shoulder. Conversations stopped when I walked into rooms. I noticed my cousin Emily whispering to her husband while glancing toward me, and when I said hello she smiled a little too politely, like someone greeting a stranger at a business conference. I told myself I was imagining things. Families get weird around the holidays. People bring stress from work, old grudges surface, someone drinks too much wine. It happens. But as the evening went on, the tension kept building in quiet little ways. My Aunt Margaret asked me how work was going but seemed distracted, like she was waiting for something else to happen. My younger cousin Ben barely spoke to me at all, even though we'd grown up practically like brothers. And every once in a while I'd catch my mother looking at me from across the room with a strange expression I couldn't quite read. Not anger. Not sadness. Something closer to worry. 2 days earlier I had received a certified letter in the mail from a law firm downtown called Harrison & Cole. It was addressed directly to me, stamped with the word confidential in neat blue ink. I hadn't opened it yet. I slipped the envelope into my jacket pocket that morning before driving to my parents' house, thinking I would deal with it later after the holiday. At the time it didn't seem urgent. Now, sitting at that long dining table while 30 relatives watched my father slowly set down his glass and look straight at me, I realized that envelope might be the most important thing in the room. My father cleared his throat the way he always did when he was about to make a speech. Before we finish dinner, he said, his voice calm but loud enough to carry across the table, there's something the family needs to address. My mother stared down at her plate. No one else spoke. Then my father turned his head and pointed directly at me. Daniel, he said, would you like to explain why money has gone missing from the family account? A ripple moved through the room like a cold breeze. A fork clattered softly against a plate. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." My father didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Because from where I'm sitting, he continued slowly, it looks like my own son stole from this family. 30 pairs of eyes shifted toward me at the same time. I felt the weight of every stare in that room, the kind that makes your chest tighten even if you know you've done nothing wrong. For a few seconds I said nothing. I simply reached into my jacket pocket and felt the edge of the sealed envelope between my fingers. Then I looked back at my father and said quietly, maybe this is the perfect moment to open something that arrived for me 2 days ago. The room stayed silent after I said those words. I could feel 30 relatives watching me, waiting for me to panic, waiting for me to defend myself. But the strange thing was that I did not feel panic anymore. What I felt was clarity. Because as I looked around that dining room, I realized something important had been building for days before this moment. The tension had not started tonight. It had started 2 days earlier, the moment the envelope arrived in my mailbox. It was a Tuesday afternoon, cold enough that the air outside my apartment in Columbus carried that sharp early winter bite that always comes right before Thanksgiving. I had just returned from the grocery store with a bag of ingredients for the pecan pie I promised to bring to dinner at my parents' house. When I opened my mailbox, I noticed a certified letter sitting inside. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, and stamped with the name Harrison & Cole Law Firm in the top corner. I remember standing there in the parking lot for a few seconds just staring at it. I do not usually receive letters from lawyers. My life is fairly simple. I work as a project manager for a logistics company, I pay my taxes, I call my parents every Sunday. Nothing about my life suggested legal mail should be arriving with my name on it. I turned the envelope over in my hands, noticing the bold red stamp that said confidential. For a moment I thought about opening it right there in the cold parking lot. But the wind was picking up and my hands were full with grocery bags, so I slipped it into the inside pocket of my jacket and decided I would read it later that evening. Except later never really came. That night I ended up working late on a shipment report that had to be finished before the holiday. The next day was even busier. And by Thursday morning, Thanksgiving Day, the envelope was still sitting unopened in my jacket pocket. Looking back now, that decision feels strange. Most people would have opened it immediately. But something about the letter gave me a quiet feeling that it was important, and important things sometimes deserve the right moment. When I drove to my parents' house that afternoon, the envelope came with me almost without thinking. It was just there in my pocket as I walked up the front steps of the same house I had visited for nearly 4 decades. My father opened the door before I even knocked. Normally he greets me with a wide smile and a firm handshake that turns into a quick hug. That day he only gave me a short nod. "You made it," he said. His voice sounded flat. Inside the house the kitchen was full of the familiar sounds of Thanksgiving. Pots simmering on the stove. The television playing a football game in the living room. My mother moving quickly between the counter and the oven with a dish towel over her shoulder. But when she saw me, she paused for a moment before smiling. "Hi Daniel," she said softly. The hug she gave me felt quick, almost distracted. I remember thinking she seemed tired. I set the pecan pie on the kitchen counter and greeted a few cousins who had already arrived. Normally those first few minutes are full of laughter and catching up. Instead the conversations felt strangely careful, like people were choosing their words before speaking. My cousin Emily asked how work was going, but she glanced at my father halfway through the question. My Uncle Gary nodded at me from across the room but did not walk over like he usually does. At first I told myself I was imagining things. Holidays can be chaotic. People get busy. But as more relatives arrived and the house filled with voices, I started noticing something else. Every once in a while someone would look at me with a brief expression that quickly disappeared the moment our eyes met. It was the kind of look people give when they know something you do not. And by the time we all sat down at that long oak table for dinner, I had the unmistakable feeling that somehow, somewhere, a story about me had already started spreading through the family. The strange part was that I had absolutely no idea what that story could be. For a few seconds after my father accused me, the only sound in the room was the faint ticking of the old wall clock in the hallway. I slowly slid the envelope halfway out of my jacket pocket but did not open it yet. Instead I looked around the table. 30 relatives sat frozen in their chairs. Some avoided my eyes completely. Others stared at me the way people look at someone they are trying to figure out. My mother still had not lifted her head from her plate. Her fork rested untouched beside the mashed potatoes. I noticed my cousin Emily whisper something to her husband while glancing in my direction. My Uncle Gary leaned back in his chair with his arms crossed, studying me like he was waiting for a confession. The strangest part was that none of them looked shocked. They looked uncomfortable, yes, but not surprised. That realization landed in my chest like a quiet weight. This conversation had clearly been happening before tonight. My father rested both hands on the table and spoke again in that same controlled voice he always used when discussing serious matters. The account your mother and I set up for family expenses is missing $40,000, he said. The bank records show the transfer happened 3 weeks ago. A murmur spread around the table. Someone softly said the number again as if repeating it would make it more believable. $40,000. My father turned slightly so that everyone could see his expression. Only 3 people have access to that account, he continued. Your mother, myself, and you. The room grew even quieter. I felt every pair of eyes shift toward me again. But I still did not speak. Instead, I watched my parents carefully. My mother finally looked up, but only for a moment. Her eyes met mine briefly before she looked away again. It was not anger I saw in her face. It was something closer to nervousness. That detail stayed with me. If she truly believed I had taken the money, she would have looked furious. But she did not. She looked uneasy. My father continued talking as if presenting evidence in a meeting. The transfer was made online, he said. And the bank confirmed the login came from a device associated with your name. Several relatives shifted in their seats. My cousin Ben exhaled slowly through his nose. Aunt Margaret looked down at the tablecloth and shook her head slightly. My father leaned forward a few inches. Daniel, he said, this is your opportunity to explain yourself. I rested my hand on the envelope still sitting in my lap. The paper felt stiff and cool against my fingers. In that moment a strange calm settled over me. Because the more I thought about everything that had happened over the past few days, the more certain I became that something about this situation did not make sense. 3 weeks ago I had been traveling for work in Denver. I had spent 4 straight days inside a warehouse coordinating a logistics project that involved shipments moving across 3 different states. My company tracked our work schedules carefully. My hotel check-in time, my expense reports, my badge scans at the facility. Every detail was documented. If the transfer happened during that trip, then someone else had moved the money while I was more than 1,000 miles away. I slowly stood from my chair. The wooden legs scraped softly against the floor. A few relatives straightened in their seats. My father watched me closely, waiting. I finally lifted the envelope the rest of the way out of my pocket and held it in my hand where everyone could see it. The cream-colored paper looked almost out of place against the dark wood of the dining table. I glanced at the return address again. Harrison and Cole Law Firm. The same name I had seen in my mailbox 2 days earlier. I looked back at my father and spoke quietly. Before I answer your question, I said, there is something everyone here should probably hear first. I slid my finger under the sealed flap of the envelope and began to open it. I slowly pulled the document from the envelope and unfolded the first page. The paper made a soft crackling sound in the quiet dining room. It was the kind of silence that only happens when an entire group of people realizes something important is about to be revealed. My father watched me closely from the other side of the table. His expression was calm, but there was a tightness in his jaw that had not been there earlier. My mother finally looked up again, her hands clasped together in front of her plate as if she was bracing herself for something she could not stop anymore. I lowered my eyes to the page and read the heading at the top. Harrison and Cole Law Firm. Beneath that was a line of bold text that said Certified Financial Notice. I took a slow breath before continuing. The document described a review of the Carter family account that my parents had mentioned earlier. According to the statement, the account activity over the past month had triggered a compliance review by the bank. That review included a complete audit of recent transfers, login locations, and authorization records. I could feel several relatives leaning forward slightly as I read. My Uncle Gary adjusted his glasses. Aunt Margaret pressed her hand against the edge of the table. The document listed the same transfer my father had mentioned. $40,000 removed from the account 3 weeks earlier. I looked up briefly. My father gave a small nod as if encouraging me to continue reading, confident that the next lines would confirm what he had already told everyone. But when I looked back down at the page, the next section of the report told a very different story. The bank audit showed the exact time the transfer had been initiated. It also showed the physical location of the device used to access the account. I spoke slowly so everyone could hear every word. The transfer was authorized at 9:42 in the morning, I read. The login occurred from a desktop computer located inside the Carter family residence. A few people shifted in their seats. My father remained perfectly still. I continued reading the next lines. Account authentication was completed using the primary account holder security credentials. I paused for a moment, then read the final line of that section. The primary account holder registered to those credentials is Robert Carter. For a second the words seemed to hang in the air like they had not fully landed yet. Then several heads turned toward my father at the same time. My cousin Ben sat up straight in his chair. Emily looked from me to my father with wide eyes. My Uncle Gary leaned forward slowly. My father's calm expression did not disappear, but something in his posture shifted almost imperceptibly. I set the paper gently on the table in front of me and looked directly at him. That means the transfer was made from this house, I said quietly. And it was made using your login credentials. No one spoke. The football game on the television in the living room suddenly sounded much louder than before. My mother pressed her lips together tightly as if she had been hoping this moment would somehow pass without reaching this point. My father finally cleared his throat again. But this time the sound was not the confident speech opening everyone had heard earlier. It was the sound of a man realizing the story he had prepared for the entire family was beginning to come apart. For several seconds no one spoke. The shift in the room was immediate and impossible to miss. 30 relatives who had been staring at me now slowly turned their attention toward my father. The air felt different, like the moment before a storm when everyone senses something changing but no one knows exactly how it will unfold. My father remained seated at the head of the table, his hands resting flat on the polished oak surface that had hosted decades of family dinners. The confident posture he had held earlier was still there, but the certainty behind it had faded slightly. My Uncle Gary was the first person to break the silence. He leaned forward in his chair and looked directly at my father. Robert, he said carefully, the report says the transfer came from this house. My father inhaled slowly and leaned back, as if preparing to explain something simple that everyone else had misunderstood. Yes, he said. From this house. His voice was calm again, but now there was a faint edge beneath it. But that does not mean I was the one who made it. Several people exchanged confused glances. My cousin Emily frowned slightly and looked back toward the document on the table in front of me. I could feel my mother watching both of us now, her expression tight with worry. My father continued speaking, choosing his words slowly. Daniel has been coming and going from this house his entire life, he said. He knows exactly where the computer is. He knows how the accounts work. The implications settled into the room like a heavy weight. A few relatives shifted uncomfortably in their chairs again. But the difference this time was obvious. The certainty that had filled the room earlier was gone. Instead there was hesitation. My Aunt Margaret quietly cleared her throat. Robert, she said softly, the document says the login used your credentials. My father nodded once as if acknowledging an obvious detail. Credentials can be used by more than one person, he replied. If someone has access to the computer. He turned his eyes toward me again. And Daniel has always had access. I watched him for a moment before speaking. I could feel the envelope still in my hand, the remaining pages inside slightly heavier than the first report I had already read. You are right, I said calmly. I have used the computer in this house before. I glanced down at the second page still folded inside the envelope. But there is more information in this report. The room grew quiet again as I unfolded the next sheet. The paper was thicker than the first page, stamped with the same law firm letterhead. My father's eyes followed the movement carefully now. I continued reading. The bank audit had not only traced the login location. It had also reviewed the security confirmation process used to complete the transfer. I read the next line slowly so every word carried across the table. The transfer required secondary verification through the registered phone number associated with the primary account holder. A few relatives leaned closer, trying to see the document from across the table. I continued reading the final line on the page. Verification code was sent to the mobile device registered to Robert Carter and confirmed at 9:43 in the morning. This time the reaction was immediate. My cousin Ben sat forward quickly in his chair. Uncle Gary looked directly at my father again. Even my mother closed her eyes briefly as if she already knew what the next moment would bring. I lowered the paper slightly and looked back at my father. The confirmation code went to your phone, I said quietly. The room fell silent again, but this silence felt very different from the one earlier in the evening. This time it was not directed at me. No one spoke after that. The words about the confirmation code seemed to settle over the table like a weight pressing down on every plate, every glass, every pair of eyes in the room. My father did not respond immediately. He simply sat there at the head of the table, his shoulders squared, his hands still resting on the wood as if he was deciding what move to make next. I watched him carefully. For most of my life I had seen my father control every room he entered. He ran his small construction company the same way he ran family gatherings, calmly, confidently, always 2 steps ahead of everyone else. But for the first time that evening I noticed something different in his eyes. Not panic. My father was not the type to panic. But calculation. The kind of quiet thinking that happens when someone realizes the situation is no longer unfolding the way they planned. My Uncle Gary shifted in his chair again and rubbed his chin slowly. Robert, he said after a moment, that code went to your phone. My father nodded once, very slightly, like a man acknowledging an obvious fact that did not yet prove anything. Phones can be left on tables, he replied calmly. People walk through this house all the time during holidays. A few relatives glanced toward the living room where coats and bags were piled near the couch. My father continued speaking in the same steady tone. If someone wanted to use the phone for a few seconds, they could. The explanation hung in the air, but it did not land the way he hoped. This time no one immediately agreed. Instead, several people looked uncertain. My cousin Emily slowly shook her head under her breath. Ben leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. Aunt Margaret folded her hands together and studied the tablecloth in front of her. I could feel the shift happening in real time. Earlier that evening the story had been simple. Money disappeared. I had access to the account. Therefore I must have taken it. But now the story had cracks in it. I glanced down at the envelope again. One more page remained inside. I lifted it carefully and unfolded it so the light above the dining table illuminated the print clearly. There is one more section in the report, I said quietly. My father's eyes moved to the paper immediately. The room grew still again. I read the heading at the top of the final page. Device activity confirmation. Beneath it was a list of details from the bank security review. I spoke slowly so every person in the room could follow each word. The computer used to initiate the transfer is identified as the desktop registered in the Carter residence office, I read. Security cameras within the residence were reviewed as part of the compliance investigation. That line alone caused several relatives to look toward the hallway that led to my father's office. Everyone in the family knew about the camera system he installed a few years earlier after a neighbor experienced a break-in. I continued reading the next sentence. The footage confirms that Robert Carter accessed the office computer at 9:41 in the morning on the day of the transfer. This time the silence was absolute. No one moved. No one even shifted in their chairs. I lowered the page slowly and looked directly at my father again. The confidence he carried earlier that evening had finally faded from his face. It was not replaced with anger or shouting. Instead, there was a long quiet moment where father and son simply looked at each other across a table filled with family members who were suddenly realizing the truth might be very different from the story they had heard. For a long moment, my father did not say anything. The words about the security footage had changed the atmosphere completely. Earlier that evening, he had been standing at the head of the table like a man presenting a clear and simple accusation. Now the same room felt like it had quietly turned in another direction. 30 relatives who had been studying me were now studying him. I could see the questions forming in their faces. My cousin Emily leaned slightly forward in her chair. Ben glanced between my father and the papers in my hand. Uncle Gary rested both elbows on the table as if he was trying to understand how the situation had shifted so quickly. My father finally inhaled slowly and pushed his chair back a few inches from the table. The wooden legs scraped softly against the floor. He stood up the same way he had earlier, straightening his shoulders and adjusting the sleeves of his shirt as if he was preparing to regain control of the room. Security cameras record a lot of things, he said evenly. But they do not explain everything. His voice was calm again, but the confidence behind it sounded thinner now. My mother looked at him carefully. I noticed the way her fingers tightened around the edge of her napkin. She had still not said a single word since the conversation began. My father continued speaking, turning slightly so everyone at the table could see him. Yes, I went into the office that morning, he said. I work in that room almost every day. He gestured briefly toward the hallway that led to the office door. But that does not prove I authorized the transfer. A few relatives exchanged uncertain looks. The explanation sounded weaker than the earlier accusations, but my father clearly hoped it would still hold together. I remained standing with the papers in my hand. I could feel the weight of every eye in the room again, but this time the attention felt very different. It was no longer suspicion directed at me. It was curiosity. People wanted to know what would come next. I looked down at the document again and then back at my father. You are right, I said quietly. Going into the office does not prove you authorized the transfer. For a moment he nodded slightly, as if relieved to hear that sentence. But then I lifted the final page again and continued. That part is explained in the next section. My father's expression changed just a little when he heard that. I read the next lines slowly. The compliance review also includes biometric confirmation data linked to the account security system. Several relatives frowned slightly, trying to follow the technical language. I continued reading. Account access required fingerprint verification through the primary authentication device registered to Robert Carter. A ripple of confusion passed through the table before the meaning settled in. Ben sat up straight again. Emily covered her mouth with one hand. Uncle Gary turned his head slowly toward my father. I lowered the page and spoke clearly so there was no confusion. The transfer required your fingerprint confirmation, I said. The room went completely silent again. Even the television in the living room seemed quieter now. My father remained standing, but his posture had changed. The certainty he carried earlier had disappeared entirely. For the first time that evening he looked not like the man in control of the room, but like someone realizing the truth had quietly caught up with him in front of everyone he knew. No one moved after that. The words about fingerprint verification settled over the room like a quiet truth that no one could easily argue with. 30 relatives sat frozen around the long oak table, the plates of Thanksgiving dinner now completely forgotten. My father remained standing where he had pushed back his chair, but the authority he carried earlier that evening had faded. His shoulders were still straight, but his eyes had begun to shift from face to face around the table, as if he was realizing. That every person in the room was now looking at him differently. Uncle Gary was the first to speak again. His voice was calm, but there was a firmness behind it that had not been there earlier. "Robert," he said slowly, "that means the transfer could only happen if you confirmed it yourself." My father did not answer immediately. He looked down at the table for a moment, then back toward me. For years I had known that look. It was the expression he used whenever he was calculating how to explain a mistake in a way that still left him in control. But this time the room was not his job site, and the people sitting around him were not employees waiting for instructions. They were family members who had just watched the entire story shift direction in front of them. My mother finally lifted her head fully. She looked at my father for several seconds before speaking for the first time that evening. "Robert," she said quietly, "what is going on?" Her voice was not angry. It sounded tired. My father exhaled slowly and rubbed the side of his forehead as if he had suddenly developed a headache. "You are all jumping to conclusions," he said. "That report does not explain the whole situation." A few relatives exchanged uncertain looks, but the doubt in the room was no longer pointed toward me. My cousin Ben leaned forward again. "Then explain it," he said. My father looked around the table once more before finally sitting back down in his chair. The movement felt less like control and more like surrendering to the fact that the conversation could not be avoided anymore. For a few seconds he stared at the empty space in front of him before speaking again. "The money was not stolen," he said quietly. That sentence alone caused several people to shift in their seats. My Aunt Margaret frowned slightly. Uncle Gary tilted his head. My father continued, his voice slower now. 3 weeks ago the company lost a contract. A big one." He paused briefly. "I needed to move funds quickly to keep payroll going until a new project comes through." A few relatives looked surprised. Everyone in the family knew my father had run his construction business for more than 20 years. The company had always seemed stable. My father glanced briefly toward my mother. Before continuing, "I planned to replace the money once the next contract closed," he said. "But when the bank flagged the transfer and started asking questions, I needed time to figure out how to handle it." The room grew quiet again as people processed what he was saying. My cousin Emily spoke carefully. "So why accuse Daniel?" she asked. My father did not answer right away. Instead he looked down at the table again, his fingers tracing the edge of his glass. Finally he spoke in a voice much quieter than before. "Because if the bank believed the transfer came from someone else with account access," he said slowly, "it would buy me time." The meaning of that sentence settled heavily across the room. 30 relatives who had gathered to celebrate Thanksgiving were now realizing exactly how close the evening had come to ending very differently. The room stayed silent long after my father finished speaking. The explanation he had finally given hung in the air, heavier than any accusation had been earlier that evening. Around the long table, 30 relatives sat motionless, absorbing what they had just heard. This dinner had started as a celebration, a familiar gathering built on decades of family traditions, but now it felt like something entirely different. Uncle Gary leaned back slowly in his chair and let out a long breath. Aunt Margaret looked down at her folded hands, her expression thoughtful but disappointed. My cousin Emily glanced toward me for a moment, then back toward my father as if trying to understand how the evening had taken such an unexpected turn. My mother remained very still beside him, her eyes fixed on the tablecloth. I realized that in all the years I had known her, I had never seen her look quite this tired. My father finally lifted his head again and looked across the table toward me. The confidence he had carried earlier was gone now. In its place was something quieter, something closer to regret. For a moment neither of us spoke. The distance across the table felt much longer than a few feet. I thought about everything that had happened over the past hour. The accusation. The stares. The feeling of standing alone in a room full of people who suddenly believed something terrible about me. Then I thought about the envelope still resting in my hand and how close I had come to never opening it at all. If I had left it at home, the entire story might have unfolded very differently. I slowly set the papers back inside the envelope and placed it on the table in front of me. The sound was soft, but it seemed to draw everyone's attention again. I looked around the room one more time. These were people who had watched me grow up, people who had celebrated birthdays and graduations and holidays together for years. Yet for a few minutes earlier that evening, many of them had believed I might be capable of stealing from my own family. That realization did not make me angry. It made me quiet. Uncle Gary cleared his throat again and looked toward my father. "Robert," he said carefully, "this is something you should have told the family from the start." My father nodded slowly. He did not argue this time. My mother finally looked up as well, her voice soft but steady. Daniel deserved better than what happened tonight. Her words were simple, but they carried across the table with surprising weight. I met her eyes for the first time since the evening began and gave a small nod. I did not need an apology in that moment. What mattered more was that the truth had finally found its way into the room. My father leaned back in his chair again and looked around at the faces of relatives who were now seeing him differently than they had at the beginning of the night. The silence that followed felt calmer than before. The tension that had filled the house earlier had slowly drained away, leaving behind something quieter and more honest. Outside the window the evening had grown darker, and the lights from neighboring houses glowed softly across the quiet suburban street. After a few moments my cousin Ben stood up and reached for the serving bowl of mashed potatoes. "Well," he said gently, "Thanksgiving dinner is getting cold." A few people smiled faintly. Plates were picked up again. Conversation slowly returned to the table, not loud and cheerful like earlier holidays, but steady and real. And as the room gradually filled with the ordinary sounds of family again, I realized that sometimes the most important thing a person can open in front of 30 relatives is not just an envelope. It is the truth.